It was a quiet morning when Sarah Cross woke up to an empty bed. That wasn't unusual. Her husband, Daniel, often left early for work, but when she found his phone sitting on the nightstand, his wallet still on the kitchen counter, and his car parked in the driveway, a strange feeling crept over her. Daniel never went anywhere without his phone. At first, she thought maybe he had gone for a walk. Maybe he needed some air. But as the hours ticked by and there was still no sign of him, worry turned into fear. She called his job. They hadn't seen him. She called his friends. No one had heard from him. By nightfall, she called the police. And that's when the real story began. The local police took the report, but a missing husband in his mid-40s wasn't their top priority. Maybe he needed a break, they told Sarah. Husbands disappear sometimes. They come back, but something felt wrong. Sarah insisted Daniel wouldn't just walk away from his life. They had been married for over 20 years. They had a house, a dog, and plans for the weekend. He was a responsible man, steady, predictable. This wasn't like him. It wasn't until 3 days later that the case caught the attention of the FBI. Not because Daniel was missing, but because of who he was. Daniel Cross wasn't just a regular guy. He was a forensic accountant working under contract for the federal government. His job? Following money trails, exposing fraud, and sometimes ruining powerful people. He had recently been assigned to a high-profile case. A case involving millions of dollars in government contracts and whispers of criminal activity in places no one dared to look. The moment the FBI realized who he was, they stepped in. Sarah didn't know where to turn. The police weren't saying much. The FBI asked a lot of questions but gave her no answers. The only thing she knew for sure was that her husband was gone. And then the letter arrived. It came in the mail, addressed to her in neat handwriting. No return address. No name. Just one sentence written in block letters. Daniel is not who you think he is. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words. What did that mean? Was he in danger? Had he been lying to her? She took the letter to the FBI. They studied it carefully, exchanged glances, and then asked her a question she never expected. Mrs. Cross, how well did you really know your husband? That question sent Sarah into a whirlwind of doubt. She thought she knew Daniel better than anyone. But when the FBI started digging into his past, cracks began to show. His work history had gaps. His financial records had inconsistencies. And then there was his name, Daniel Cross, a simple name, a common name, but one that, according to official records, didn't exist before 2002. Before that year, Daniel Cross had no history, no birth certificate, no school records, no past. It was as if he had stepped into existence out of nowhere. Sarah went home that night and tore through their house. Old documents, photographs, anything that could tell her who her husband really was. She found their wedding certificate, their mortgage paperwork, and years of tax returns. But something stood out, a folder hidden at the back of a filing cabinet. Inside were documents with names she didn't recognize. Different names, different social security numbers. Some had Daniel's face on them, others didn't. And then, at the very bottom, she found a passport. Not in the name of Daniel Cross, but in a name she had never seen before. The next morning, Sarah stormed into the FBI's office. She demanded answers, but the agents only told her one thing. Mrs. Cross, we need you to stay calm. We're handling this. But Sarah wasn't calm. She was terrified. Who was her husband? Why was the FBI involved? And most importantly, where was he now? As she stood there in the cold, sterile office, one of the agents leaned in and whispered something she would never forget. We don't think Daniel Cross is missing. She swallowed hard. We think he ran. Sarah walked out of the FBI building in a daze. She had come looking for answers, but now she had even more questions. If Daniel ran, why didn't he take his phone, his wallet, or his car? If he wasn't who he said he was, then who was he? And if someone wanted her to believe he had vanished, what were they trying to hide? With the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her, Sarah realized one thing. She was about to uncover a truth that was never meant to be found. Sarah Cross sat alone in her dimly lit living room, staring at the folder she had pulled from the back of the filing cabinet. The documents inside felt like a stranger's life, yet they all led back to the man she had spent the last 20 years beside. The house felt different now, cold, empty. The air was thick with questions. Daniel's shoes were still by the door. His favorite coffee mug sat in the sink. It was as if he had just stepped out for a moment. But he hadn't, and the FBI seemed to believe that wasn't an accident. Sarah gripped the fake passport in her hands. The name was unfamiliar, but the photo was unmistakable. It was Daniel, only it wasn't. The next morning, Sarah forced herself into a routine. She made coffee, fed the dog, and tried to pretend everything was fine. But the weight of the FBI's words sat heavy in her chest. We don't think Daniel Cross is missing. We think he ran. But if he ran, why had he left behind everything that tied him to this life? His job, his phone, his identity, something didn't add up. She decided to start where any wife would, with the people who knew him best. Sarah drove across town to see Kevin Moore, Daniel's closest friend. They had met at work years ago, both accountants, both practical men. If anyone knew what Daniel was hiding, it was Kevin. When she arrived, Kevin looked uncomfortable. He invited her in, but he kept glancing at his watch, as if he didn't want her to stay long. Sarah wasted no time. Kevin, I need you to be honest with me. Did Daniel ever say anything about leaving? Kevin hesitated. No, not exactly. Sarah narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? Kevin sighed, rubbing his temples. A few weeks ago, he started acting different. Paranoid, checking his phone all the time. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I shouldn't ask questions. Sarah's stomach twisted. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I thought he was just stressed about work. He said he was looking into something big. Something dangerous. Sarah leaned forward. What was it? Kevin hesitated again. Then, in a low voice, he said, he never told me. Just that, if he messed up, people would come looking for him. Sarah's blood ran cold. After leaving Kevin's house, Sarah felt more lost than ever. But if Daniel was running from something, there had to be a trail. She went home and logged into their bank account. It looked normal: bills, groceries, usual spending. But when she dug deeper, something strange stood out. A week before he disappeared, Daniel had withdrawn $15,000 in cash. Sarah had never seen that money. She checked his credit cards. No recent charges. No hotel bookings, no flights, no car rentals. It was as if he had taken the money and vanished into thin air. She sat back, staring at the screen. Had Daniel left on his own, or had someone forced him to run? Later that night, Sarah heard a knock at the door. It was their neighbor, an older man named Rick, who lived across the street. I saw something the night Daniel disappeared, Rick said. Sarah's heart pounded. What did you see? Rick hesitated. I wasn't going to say anything, but I saw a black SUV parked outside your house late that night. Didn't think much of it at the time, but when I woke up around 3 a.m., it was still there. Then it just drove off. Sarah felt a chill creep over her. Did you see who was inside? Rick shook his head. Tinted windows. But it wasn't a normal car for your street. Sarah swallowed hard. Had someone been watching Daniel? Had they been waiting for him? Sarah rushed back to the FBI office the next morning. She slammed the fake passport onto the agent's desk. Tell me the truth. Who is my husband? The agent studied her carefully. Then he leaned forward. We believe Daniel Cross isn't his real name, he said. Sarah's heart pounded. Then who is he? The agent's expression didn't change. We're still working on that. She clenched her fists. You know more than you're telling me. The agent let out a slow breath. Mrs. Cross, your husband was involved in something bigger than you realize. If he ran, it wasn't by choice. And if he didn't run, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Sarah's voice shook. Is he dead? The agent didn't answer. Instead, he slid a file across the desk. She opened it. Inside was a grainy security photo. A man standing in an airport. It was Daniel. Only the timestamp was from 2 nights ago, after he had already disappeared. Sarah walked out of the FBI office in a daze. If Daniel had left willingly, Why hadn't he contacted her? Why leave behind his phone, his car, his life? And if he hadn't left willingly, who was pulling the strings? One thing was clear. Whoever Daniel really was, he was still alive. And someone was trying to make sure she never found out the truth. Sarah stared at the grainy image in her shaking hands. It was her husband. Same face, same posture, same way he always carried his bag over his right shoulder. But there was one problem. This photo was taken 2 nights ago, after he had disappeared. Her mind raced. If Daniel had left on his own, why hadn't he contacted her? Why leave behind everything? And if he hadn't left on his own, if someone had forced him, why did the FBI have this photo? She looked up at the agent sitting across from her. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "You told me you think he ran." The agent leaned forward. "We said we think he's not missing. That doesn't mean he left by choice." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The next day, Sarah drove back home in a daze. The FBI wasn't giving her all the answers, but they were asking questions that made her stomach turn. How well had she really known her husband? She pulled out the old folder again, flipping through the names, IDs, and documents. There were at least 4 different names, all tied to Daniel. Some had matching birth dates, others didn't. She picked up the passport, the one with a name she had never seen before. James Cole. It sounded generic, but when she typed it into a search engine, she found nothing. No records, no history, just an empty name. Her husband had a name that didn't exist. Sarah wasn't ready to go back to the FBI. If they weren't telling her the full truth, she'd have to find it herself. She went to Daniel's office, looking for anything he might have left behind. She searched through the desk, checked his work laptop, dug through old receipts. And then she found it. A key. A small, worn key with the words, "Lock Safe Storage, Unit 513, stamped onto it. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had never heard Daniel mention a storage unit before. Why would he need one? That evening, Sarah drove across town to the storage facility. It was in a quiet area, nothing special. Just rows of metal doors stretching down long corridors. She found Unit 513. The key slid in smoothly, the lock clicking open. Her hands trembled as she pulled the door up. Inside, there was no furniture, no old boxes of childhood memories, just a single black duffel bag sitting in the center of the floor. She stepped inside, heart pounding, and unzipped the bag. What she found inside made her blood run cold. Bundles of cash, stacks and stacks of $100 bills, a gun, fully loaded, and at the very bottom, a second passport. The name was different from the one in the folder. Ethan Shaw. Sarah sank to her knees. How many names did her husband have? And why would a forensic accountant need a gun and stacks of cash hidden away? Before she could even begin to process what she had found, something else caught her attention. A disposable cell phone. It was still powered on, resting beside the gun. Sarah picked it up, hands shaking, and clicked into the call history. There was only one recent call, made at 2:14 a.m. the night Daniel disappeared, to a number she didn't recognize. Her fingers hovered over the dial button. Whoever Daniel had called that night might know what had happened to him. She took a deep breath and pressed call. The phone rang twice. Then a man answered. "Who is this?" His voice was sharp, controlled. Sarah swallowed hard. I found this phone in my husband's storage unit. I think The man cut her off. "Where is Daniel?" Her pulse pounded in her ears. "I don't know. He's missing." A long silence. Then the man spoke again, his voice lower this time. "If Daniel is missing, then he's already dead." Sarah's breath hitched. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The man exhaled. "You need to get out of this, lady. Whatever you think you know about your husband, you don't. Walk away, because if you don't, they'll come for you next." Before she could ask another question, the line went dead. Sarah slowly lowered the phone, her hands trembling. Daniel wasn't just missing, and he wasn't just running. Someone had been after him, and now they were coming for her. Sarah left the storage unit in a hurry, her heart pounding. She drove home in silence, replaying the man's words in her head. If Daniel is missing, Then he's already dead. But the FBI had proof he was alive 2 nights ago. None of it made sense. When she pulled into her driveway, something felt off. The porch light was off. The front door was unlocked. She knew she had locked it before she left. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The house was silent, empty, and then she saw it, sitting on the kitchen table. Another letter, just like the first one, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a single line written in the same block letters. Stop looking. Sarah stood frozen in place. Someone had been inside her home, watching her, waiting, and now they were letting her know she was next. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the letter. Stop looking. Whoever had written it had been inside her home. They hadn't broken in. They had come in, left their warning, and walked out, completely unnoticed. She took slow, careful steps back toward the door, her mind racing. Someone had been watching her, following her. They knew she had gone to the storage unit. Had they been following her for longer? She stepped outside, scanning the dark street. Every parked car felt like a threat. Every shadow looked like it was moving. She locked the door and grabbed her phone. She had no choice. She needed help. She called the only people who might have answers. The FBI. Sarah sat in the sterile interrogation room, the clock ticking loudly on the wall. Agent Phillips, the man leading the investigation, sat across from her. He looked unimpressed as she slid the letter across the table. This was in my house when I got home, Sarah said. Someone broke in. Phillips glanced at the note, then back at her. And you're sure nothing else was taken? Sarah's jaw clenched. Does it matter? Someone is watching me. The agent leaned back in his chair. You've been digging where you shouldn't. You went to the storage unit. Sarah's stomach twisted. How do you know that? Phillips exhaled. Because we've been watching you. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Excuse me? Phillips crossed his arms. Mrs. Cross, you don't seem to understand the situation you're in. We don't know who your husband really is. But we do know that you poking around could make things worse. For you, Sarah's voice shook. So you're telling me to stop looking, too? Phillips didn't answer. That was all she needed to hear. The FBI didn't want her to find the truth, and that meant she was closer to it than they wanted her to be. Sarah left the FBI office, her mind spinning. If she couldn't trust them, she had to keep searching alone. She spent the rest of the night going through Daniel's files again. She had to be missing something. That's when she saw it. An old bank statement from an account she didn't recognize. She logged in using Daniel's usual passwords. Most didn't work. But after multiple tries, one finally let her in. The balance made her breath catch in her throat. $2.8 million. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands. Daniel had been hiding millions of dollars in a secret account. She scrolled through the account history. Most transactions were small, moving money between different accounts. But there was one that stood out. A single transfer of $250,000, wired to an offshore account, just one day before Daniel disappeared. There was no name attached, just a set of numbers. Sarah copied them down. She didn't know who the money had gone to, but one thing was clear. Daniel had been preparing for something, and now, someone was making sure she didn't find out what it was. Sarah barely slept that night. Every noise outside made her jump. She felt like she was being watched. By morning, she knew she couldn't stay in the house. She packed a bag, grabbed the duffel from the storage unit, and left. As she pulled out of the driveway, she noticed something in her rearview mirror. A black SUV, sitting at the end of her street. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah's hands gripped the wheel. If someone was following her, she needed to be smart. She drove calmly, keeping an eye on the mirror. The SUV stayed behind her. Not too close, not too far, just watching. She turned left. So did they. She turned right. They followed. Her heart pounded. Whoever was in that car wasn't hiding anymore. They wanted her to know they were there. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't go home. She couldn't go to the police. And the FBI wasn't helping. She needed to disappear, just like Daniel had. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. If she wanted to find the truth, She had to become just as invisible as the man she was chasing. She checked the duffel bag in the passenger seat, the cash, the gun, the phone. She had everything she needed. It was time to vanish. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel as she sped down the highway. The black SUV was still behind her, maintaining distance but never leaving her sight. She had no plan, no idea where to go. The money in the duffel bag could buy her time, but it wouldn't buy her safety. She needed to disappear, just like Daniel. But how do you vanish when someone is watching your every move? She took an unexpected exit, weaving through unfamiliar streets. The SUV followed. Her heart pounded. If they wanted to stop her, they could have already. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. For what? She needed to break the pattern. She spotted a busy shopping center and made a sharp turn into the parking lot. The SUV slowed but didn't follow. Sarah exhaled. They didn't want to be seen. That meant they were professionals. That meant she was in real danger. She pulled into a parking spot and grabbed the burner phone from the duffel bag. The number Daniel had called before he disappeared still lingered on the screen. She dialed it again. This time, the man answered immediately. "I told you to walk away," he said. Sarah clenched her jaw. "I don't have that choice." Silence. "Then, you found the account, didn't you?" Sarah's breath caught. "Who are you?" The man ignored her question. "They're watching you now, aren't they?" Sarah turned, scanning the lot. The SUV was still parked on the street. "Yes." A pause. Then the man spoke again, voice lower. "Listen carefully. If you want to live, you need to disappear. Right now." Sarah swallowed hard. "How?" Another pause. "Then, there's a bus station 3 miles from where you are. Take nothing but cash. Leave your car behind. If they think you're gone, they'll stop looking." Sarah hesitated. "And then what?" The man's voice turned sharp. "Then you find me. Because if you don't, you'll never find your husband." The line went dead. Sarah's heart pounded. She didn't know if she could trust this man. But what choice did she have? She couldn't go home. She couldn't go to the FBI. She grabbed the duffel bag and stepped out of the car. With one last look at the black SUV in the distance, she walked away. She left her car keys on a nearby bench. She took a deep breath, kept her head down, and blended into the crowd. And just like that, Sarah Cross disappeared. An hour later, Sarah sat on a nearly empty bus, watching the city fade in the distance. She was alone. No phone, no car, no way for them to track her. She checked the address scribbled on a piece of paper, the meeting place the man had given her. It was hours away, a small town in the middle of nowhere. She had no idea what she was walking into, but if it meant finding Daniel, she would do it. The bus ride was long and silent. Sarah kept an eye on the passengers around her. No one seemed suspicious, but when the bus pulled into the dusty little town, her gut twisted. A man was waiting, tall, built like someone who had seen his share of fights. His sharp gaze locked onto her the second she stepped off the bus. He wasn't a local. He was waiting for her. Sarah hesitated, gripping the duffel bag. Then the man stepped forward. "I hope you're ready," he said, "because the people chasing you, they don't leave loose ends." Sarah swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man studied her. "The only person who can tell you the truth about your husband." Sarah exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. She had spent her life thinking she knew who Daniel was. But now, standing in front of a man who knew more than she did, she realized something terrifying. She hadn't just married a liar. She had married a ghost. And now she was next. Sarah stood frozen at the edge of the bus station parking lot, gripping the strap of her duffel bag. The man in front of her was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of presence that demanded attention. He wasn't asking her to follow him. He was telling her. She hesitated. "Who are you?" The man's eyes flicked toward the empty road behind them. "That's not the question you should be asking." Sarah's pulse pounded. "Then what should I be asking?" The man took a slow step forward. "How much do you really want to know about your husband?" Sarah knew she had two choices: walk away and pretend none of this ever happened, or follow the only person willing to give her answers. She chose the second option. The man led her away from the bus station to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. He unlocked a room and motioned for her to step inside. Sarah hesitated. "How do I know I can trust you?" The man exhaled. "You don't. But I'm the only one keeping you alive right now." That was enough. She stepped inside. The man shut the door and leaned against the wall, watching her carefully. "Your husband," he said, "isn't missing. He's running." Sarah's stomach twisted. Running from what? The man sat down on the edge of the bed. "The people who paid him to lie." Sarah frowned. "Lie about what?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. He tossed it onto the table between them. "That," he said, "is the reason your husband doesn't exist." Sarah hesitated before picking up the flash drive. She plugged it into the old laptop on the desk and waited as the screen flickered to life. Hundreds of files appeared. Financial records, government contracts, names, dates. And then she saw Daniel's name, but not as an accountant, as an informant. Sarah's heart pounded. He worked for the government? The man nodded. Your husband wasn't just a forensic accountant. He was an asset. He created false financial trails to hide dirty money for the FBI. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. That's impossible. He never, the man cut her off. You really think he spent years investigating fraud and never once told you details about his cases? That's because he wasn't investigating fraud. He was creating it. Sarah's hands shook. Why would the FBI do that? The man leaned forward. To make people disappear. Sarah's stomach twisted. I don't understand. The man exhaled. Your husband's job was to bury financial trails, to make people look guilty when they weren't, to cover up real crimes by planting fake evidence. The kind of work that doesn't exist on paper. The kind of work that gets people killed. Sarah felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Daniel wouldn't. The man cut her off. He did. And when he realized the people he was covering for were worse than the ones he was setting up, he tried to get out. Sarah's head spun. So they made him disappear? The man's jaw tightened. No, he disappeared himself. He knew they'd kill him if he stayed. Sarah stared at the laptop screen, trying to process what she was seeing. Her husband hadn't just lied to her. He had lied to the world. The man studied her carefully. Now do you understand why they're watching you? Sarah swallowed hard. They think I know something. The man nodded. They're waiting to see if Daniel told you anything. If they think you're a threat, you won't live long enough to find him. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Then what do I do? The man hesitated, then slid a piece of paper across the table. An address. If you want to find your husband, this is where you start. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What's there? The man stood up and grabbed his jacket. The only person Daniel ever trusted. As Sarah stared at the address, her mind raced. She had spent the last 20 years married to a man who wasn't real. And now, if she wasn't careful, she was going to end up just like him. Gone. Sarah looked up. Why are you helping me? The man gave a small, humorless smile. Because I used to be just like Daniel. And with that, he walked out, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of the truth. Sarah took a deep breath and tucked the piece of paper into her pocket. She had a choice. She could walk away and spend the rest of her life pretending she never knew the truth. Or she could follow the trail Daniel left behind and risk everything to find him. Sarah grabbed the duffel bag and stood. She had made her choice. She was going to find her husband, no matter what it cost her. Sarah sat in her motel room, staring at the address written on the slip of paper. It was a place she had never heard of, a town she had never been to. But if what the man said was true, then this was her last chance to find Daniel. She didn't have time to hesitate. The people watching her weren't going to wait forever. She stuffed the flash drive, the burner phone, and as much cash as she could into a backpack. She left the duffel bag behind. It was too obvious. Then she stepped out of the motel and disappeared into the night. Sarah didn't take the bus this time. She knew better. She paid cash for an old car at a rundown dealership, something forgettable. Then she drove through back roads, avoiding highways, making sure she wasn't followed. Every car behind her felt like a threat. Every stoplight felt too long. She barely slept, barely ate. She didn't turn on the radio. She just drove. And after 12 hours on the road, she finally arrived. A tiny, forgotten town. A place where no one asked questions. The kind of place you go when you don't want to be found. The address led her to a house just outside of town, tucked deep in the woods. It was old, but sturdy. The kind of place that had been standing for decades, untouched by time. Sarah parked a mile away and approached on foot. She had no idea who she was walking into, but she wasn't going to take chances. She reached the porch and hesitated. Then she knocked. Silence. She knocked again. This time, she heard movement inside. A slow shuffle. Then the door cracked open, and an old man peered out. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp despite the years. He looked at Sarah, then at the road behind her. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah's breath caught. "Who are you?" The old man studied her. "The real question is, who was your husband?" Sarah stepped inside cautiously. The house was small but filled with stacks of old newspapers, boxes of documents, and a faint smell of coffee and dust. The old man motioned for her to sit. "Daniel sent you, didn't he?" Sarah's pulse quickened. "He's alive." The old man let out a dry chuckle. "For now." Sarah clenched her fists. "I need to know the truth." The old man nodded slowly, then poured himself a cup of coffee. "You think your husband worked for the FBI?" Sarah hesitated. "He did." The old man shook his head. "No, he worked against them." Sarah's stomach twisted. "What?" The man exhaled. Daniel Cross wasn't a government accountant. He was a fixer, cleaner. He made people disappear. But when he found out who he was really working for, he ran. Sarah's hands trembled. Who was he working for? The old man leaned forward. The FBI's shadow unit. The part of the agency that doesn't exist on paper. The part that controls people, plants evidence, and erases problems. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You're lying." The old man just smiled. "You wouldn't be here if I was." The old man stood and rummaged through a stack of files. He pulled out a faded newspaper clipping and handed it to her. A headline from years ago. A man who had died in an accident. A man Daniel had been investigating. Sarah's breath caught. This was fake. The old man nodded. "Your husband was part of the cover-up. Until he wasn't." Sarah's hands shook as she looked at the article. Daniel had spent years hiding the truth for other people. But now he had become the target. Sarah looked up. "If Daniel's alive, where is he?" The old man sighed. "He's running. But he left something behind. Something they don't want you to find." Sarah's heart pounded. "What is it?" The old man hesitated. Then he handed her a small, folded piece of paper. Coordinates. A location. The last place Daniel had been seen before he vanished. Sarah's pulse raced. If she went there, she'd find out the truth. Or she'd never come back. Sarah stood up and tucked the coordinates into her pocket. She had a choice. She could walk away, pretend none of this ever happened, and live the rest of her life in the dark. Or she could follow Daniel's trail and uncover the truth that had almost gotten him killed. She looked at the old man. "If I go, what happens next?" The old man sighed. "If you go, you won't be Sarah Cross anymore." Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't sure she ever had been. Sarah gripped the steering wheel as she followed the coordinates. The road was barely a road, just a narrow dirt path leading deeper into the woods. The further she drove, the less she felt like she was in the real world. No signs, no houses, no cell service, just trees. The old man's warning echoed in her mind. "If you go, you won't be Sarah Cross anymore." She didn't care. She had come too far to turn back. If Daniel had left this place as his last clue, she was going to find out why. After an hour of driving, she spotted something through the trees. A small structure, half hidden by overgrown brush. A cabin. Sarah slowed the car and killed the engine. She grabbed the backpack and stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. It was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. She moved toward the cabin, heart pounding. The door was slightly open. She stepped inside. The cabin was empty except for a single wooden table. On top of it, something had been left behind. A folder. Sarah hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were papers, documents, photographs, handwritten notes, and at the very bottom, a letter. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It was in Daniel's handwriting. She swallowed hard and read, "Sarah, if you found this, then I didn't make it. And now they're coming for you, too." Her breath caught. She gripped the letter tighter. "I never wanted you to be part of this. I spent years trying to protect you from what I was really doing. But now there's no protecting you. You've seen too much." Sarah's pulse pounded. She looked back at the documents, lists of names, bank transactions, all tied to government contracts. She wasn't looking at evidence of fraud. She was looking at a kill list. Daniel had been tracking who the FBI had erased. And now he was one of them. At the bottom of the letter, there was one last line. "If you want to know the full truth, find Evan Reed." Sarah's stomach dropped. That was the name of the man who had answered the burner phone. The same man who had told her Daniel was already dead. A noise outside made her freeze. A car. Sarah's mind snapped back into survival mode. She stuffed the papers into her backpack and ran out the back door. She ducked behind a tree just as two men stepped out of a black SUV. They were dressed in plain clothes, but Sarah didn't need a badge to know who they were. FBI. The real kind. The kind that didn't knock. One of them spoke into a radio. Target location secured. No sign of the asset. Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't here for Daniel. They were here for her. Sarah didn't wait. She turned and ran. The forest was thick, the ground uneven, but she didn't stop. She heard voices behind her. Footsteps. They knew she was here. She pushed herself forward, heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out. She had to find Evan Reed. And she had to finish what Daniel started. Sarah didn't stop running until she reached the road. She didn't look back. She had been searching for Daniel. But now she was searching for something bigger. The truth. And she wasn't going to stop until she exposed it. Even if it meant becoming a ghost herself. 3 weeks later, a woman stepped off a bus in a city where no one knew her name. She carried nothing but a small backpack and a folded piece of paper. The name on her old ID, Sarah Cross, no longer existed. The bank accounts, the house, everything tied to her past was gone. She had erased herself, just like Daniel. Now she had only one mission: find Evan Reed. Sarah, if she could even call herself that anymore, had followed the last clue Daniel had left behind. It led her to a rundown bar in Chicago. The kind of place where no one asked questions. She sat at the counter, staring at the clock. Evan Reed was supposed to be here, but he wasn't. Instead, someone else slid into the seat beside her. A woman, late 40s, sharp eyes, a knowing smile. "You're looking for a dead man," she said. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Evan Reed is dead?" The woman nodded. "Killed 2 days ago. Car accident." Sarah exhaled, gripping the counter. She was too late, but the woman wasn't finished. "You must be Sarah Cross," she said. Sarah's pulse spiked. She hadn't told anyone her real name. Sarah turned to the woman. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "A friend. Someone who wants the same thing you do." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "And what's that?" The woman's smile faded. "To burn the FBI's secret unit to the ground." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone. The woman placed a USB drive on the counter and slid it towards Sarah. Daniel didn't just run. He left something behind. Something that could take them down. Sarah hesitated before picking it up. "What's on this?" The woman stood, pulling on her coat. "Everything." Then she walked out the door. Sarah stared at the USB drive in her palm. This was bigger than Daniel. Bigger than her. She had been searching for her husband. But now she was holding the last thing he died for. And for the first time, she knew exactly what she had to do. Sarah pocketed the drive, took a deep breath, and walked out of the bar. She wasn't running anymore. She was hunting. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she exposed the FBI's greatest con. Whatever it took, whoever it cost. because Sarah Cross might have disappeared. But the truth never would. Sarah sat in a cheap motel room, the glow of the laptop screen flickering against the walls. She plugged in the USB drive the woman had given her. Took a moment to load. Then, file after file appeared on the screen. Financial records, covert operations, names of people who had been erased. And at the very top, one final file, titled in all caps, "If I die, read this, DC." Sarah's breath caught. Daniel had left her one last message. Her hands shook as she opened the file. A video, and then her husband's face filled the screen. Daniel looked tired, hollow-eyed. He was sitting in a dark room, staring into the camera. "If you're watching this, I didn't make it," he said. Sarah's stomach twisted. Daniel exhaled. "I tried to fix things. I thought I could outsmart them. I thought I could run. But you can't run from ghosts." He swallowed hard. "The FBI's secret unit, the people I worked for, they don't just kill people. They rewrite history. They make sure no one even remembers you existed." Sarah clenched her fists. "I know they'll come for you too," Daniel said. "But if anyone can finish this, it's you." His voice dropped lower. "There's one name that matters more than all the others. The name of the man who controls everything." Daniel leaned closer to the camera. "Find him." The screen went black. And then, a single name flashed across the screen. Nathaniel Kane. Sarah's pulse pounded. The man behind it all. The one Daniel had been trying to expose. And now it was her turn to finish what he started. Sarah closed the laptop, her mind racing. Daniel was gone, but he had left her the one thing no one else had. The truth. And she wasn't going to stop until she burned Nathaniel Kane's entire empire to the ground. Sarah grabbed her bag, pulled on her jacket, and stepped into the night. She had been a wife, a fugitive, a ghost. Now she was something else, a woman on a mission, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Because if the FBI wanted to erase people from history, she was about to make sure they never erased another name again. Watch out for part 2.